Today we're going to be learning Beitzah Daf Yud Aleph. It's the Daf for Shabbat. We're going to be continuing in trying to understand the Mishnah relating to birds and different details about the dovecotes that we talked about. In the Mishnah on Yud Amud Bet, it said, if you find birds b'toch haken, you designated the birds when they were in the nest, and then you found them though the next day when you came on Yantif outside the nest, lifnei in front of the nest, asurim. So the Gemara starts off with that at the very top of our daf today and says, Lema Mesayeh le Rabbi Chanina. Maybe this supports the statement of Rabbi Chanina. Ta'amar Rabbi Chanina, rov v'karov helech achar harov. If you have two factors that help you determine what the law is. So this is a classic case when it comes up with the stores, where we have X amount of stores. Certain ones are kosher, certain ones are not kosher, right? The Tesha Chanuyot case. 9 stores are kosher, 1 is not kosher, or the reverse. And then we find a piece of meat, we can assume it goes by the majority. What if it's karov? What if we find the piece of meat right outside the store, one of the stores? And let's say the majority are kosher, the minority is not kosher, but we found the piece of meat right outside the non-kosher store. So what do we go by, rov or karov? So Rabbi Chanina says, rov v'karov halach achar harov. If it's a choice between this or that, we go by what's by the majority, not by what's karov. So that would make sense in terms of this case, because what did this case say? If I designated them in the nest, and then I found birds the next day, not in the nest, I found them outside the nest, they're forbidden. We can't assume they're the ones that I designated before. Why not? Wouldn't you assume karov, they're right nearby? So this must be rov. Most birds are not from this nest. Most birds are all over the place. So rov is telling us, no, it's not from the nest, from this nest. Karov is telling us it's likely from the nest. So, and we hold by rov, we don't permit it. Must be, this supports Rabbi Chanina. To which we're going to have two explanations, Rav and Abaye, each explaining why it doesn't teach us anything about rov and karov. So Amar Abaye b'daf, it's talking about where there was a shelf outside the nest. Now, when there's a shelf outside the nest, okay, I know this goes on in my house. I have an antenna that we actually don't even use. If anyone wants to advise me about how best way to get that down, I'd be happy to hear some advice. Maybe you just want to come over one day and do it. But I have this antenna that's totally useless on top of my roof. But what happens? All the birds come hang out there and they sit on it because it's a great place for birds to be perched. Birds like to sit on something. So if there's a shelf right outside the bird's nest, and the birds are sitting there, it's not necessarily any more likely that the birds came from that nest than came from anywhere else, because birds are always going from one place to another, and it's the karov wouldn't really be a factor here. So this isn't a case of rov and karov is telling you. Karov really means what's the likelihood of who it is that's sitting on there. Could be any bird. So there is no really karov working against the rov. Everything's really saying that it's unlikely that it was the birds that were in that nest, and therefore this doesn't teach you anything about Rabbi Chanina's statement about rov and karov. Rava Amar b'shnei kinim zo lamala mizo askinan. We're actually talking about two nests, one above the other, and we're talking about that they're little birds that are young and they can't really walk, so they can't fly very well. So now he says like this, lo mebaya. The Mishnah doesn't even need to tell us this because it's obvious. We'll see, but it really wanted to tell us a different case. But we'll start with the case that's more obvious. Lo mebaya zimem batachtona velo zimem be'elyona. There was a lower one and an upper one, and I said I want to take the birds from the lower nest, and I didn't say I want the upper ones. When I came back to the nest, no birds in the lower, no birds in the upper. Remember, it was the lower ones that I said I wanted. Umatza batachtona. In the end, then, when I come back, I find not in the lower nest, but I find in a shelf or a little ledge outside the lower nest, which remember, the lower one was the one I designated. But since I don't find birds in the upper nest either, it means all the birds left the nest and we don't know who's where. So now, I found on the lower perch, but I didn't find on the upper one. Asiran. Obviously, they're forbidden. Why? You might say, well, wouldn't we assume it came from the lower one? But no. We can assume, and it's a possibility, that the ones that were in the lower nest that I designated yesterday flew off. Vahanach and the other ones that were above, Ishtarbuve, ishtarbuv unnechut. They crept their way down to the bottom because it's very easy to go downward. So they crept their way down, and now they're on this little ledge. But not only in that case are we going to assume I can't, but even if it's the reverse. I designated the ones in the upper. Not the lower ones. And I found birds in the upper one, but I didn't find lower. We're still going to say it's forbidden. We can assume, in other words, in this case, they would have to climb upward. That's much more difficult. But we're still going to assume that it's possible they climbed upward, that the upper ones that I designated yesterday flew off. Those other ones managed their way to creep up and get up to the upper one. So we still can assume that they came from the bottom, which is the one that I didn't designate, and therefore we don't allow me to eat them, right? To slaughter them and eat them. Next case in the Mishnah. The next line said, if they're the only birds around, then they're permitted. This is a very strange line, right? We all know birds fly all over the place. So what does it mean there's no birds in the area? So, hechidami, what's the case? If they're ones that fly, we can easily say those flew off and other ones flew in its place, and we have no idea, no way to know. It must be if we say that they're ones that only know how to hop around, they can't get very far. That also isn't likely it's the case, because if there's another nest within 50 cubits, we can assume, right, that birds, we're going to now say in a minute that we know it's a fact that some rabbi established, that birds who hop can get as far as 50 cubits. So if it's that there was another nest within 50 cubits, then we can assume that the other bird maybe got over there. And if you want to say, oh, well, the Mishnah is talking about a place where there's more than 50 cubits between this nest and the nearest nest, and these are birds that only hop and they clearly can't get there, then pshita de mutarim, then it would be totally obvious that they're permitted, in which case the Mishnah wouldn't need to tell us this. To Amar Mar Ukva, and this is, I told you, we're going to see somebody says this, Mar Ukva Bar Chama said, Kol hamidadeh emidadeh yoter mechamishim ama. When a bird hops, it can only hop up to 50 cubits. So therefore, once we know that, we know this Mishnah, we don't need the Mishnah to tell us this. So what's the Mishnah telling us? Well, la'olam, it must be, de'ika kem betoch hamishim ama. There is another nest within 50 cubits. So why are we permitted and assume that the bird that's sitting here is the one that I designated yesterday? Ukigon dekaima b'keren zavit. We have, let's say, a wall or a house it's got a corner to it. So on one side, let's say there's a right angle between them. One side there's a nest, and on the other side there's a nest. Now you can't see one from the other. Ma'u detema, you might have thought, idadu, because it's less than 50 cubits, maybe he could hop over to the next nest. Kamashma, and it comes to teach you, the Mishnah, when it said, if there's only this nest, then they're mutarim. We assume it's just these birds. Well, it is within 50 cubits, there's another nest, but it's not within his line of vision. Why is that important? Because we've learned, or the Mishnah is establishing, Kamash Malan, Kol Hecha de Midadeh, V'hadar Chazi L'Kineh, Midadeh, V'lo Lo Midadeh. If you can wander, okay, I'll give you an example. Kids, okay, most little kids, I can't say all, there are definitely people whose kids wander off and get totally lost and will go without their parents somewhere, but most little kids will only wander within eyesight of their parents. If they can't find their parents, they won't keep going. They'll be scared. Likewise, the bird will hop, a bird that hops will hop along, but never that far that they can't, or never out of sight of their nest. So therefore, if it's on the other side of the wall, which they can't see, they won't be able to see their original nest from there, then they won't go there. So therefore, if the other nest is not within eyesight range, then there's no way that bird will get there. And therefore, you can assume it was your original birds. And that's what the Mishnah is teaching us according to the Gemara's conclusion. New Mishnah. Continuing in this topic that seems to come up a lot about muktzah and things being designated. So you can't carry the pestle. Okay, this is the part that you use to crush things in the mortar and pestle. You can't carry a pestle, you can't pick it up to use it, l'katsev ala basar, to chop meat on it. Okay, you have to imagine a big, thick pestle that, is big enough that you would think to chop meat on it, but you can't pick it up to chop meat on it. Why not, according to Beit Shammai? Well, it's what we call a klisha melachto le'isul. It's forbidden to do something that you can't do on Shabbos. You can't, or Yantif, you can't crush things. Okay, even on Yantif, you can't crush them. So you can't use it in order to do something that is permitted, like cutting meat. Can't do that. Beit Hillel matirin. Beit Hillel permit this because Beit Hillel says, yes, you can. Because Beit Hillel says, a klisha melachto le'isur, and this is how we paskin, can be used litzorach mekomo or litzorach gufo. Mekomo is if it's in your way, like it's on your table and you need the space, you can move it. But litzorach gufo is what we're talking about here, which is you need it for itself, meaning you need some sort of thing to use for chopping your meat up, to put your meat on, to cut it up. And this can function as that function, right? Like let's say you have a pen and you want to use the pen as a bookmark. So theoretically on Shabbat, you can do that. Okay, we generally avoid doing it, but you really could if you really needed it. Obviously, why would we avoid doing that? Because you can use something else. And it's better to find something that's not muktzah. But theoretically, right, the worst kind of muktzah, the highest level, is something that's useless in general, like rocks. That you can't even use for this purpose, unless you designated it before. But here we're talking about you didn't designate it before, but since it is a utensil, it's got a use. Now, the use can't be used on Shabbat, but it does have a use, so you can use it for something that's permitted. That's what Beit Hillel says. Second halacha, Beit Shammai omrim ein notnim et ha'or lifnei hadorsan. You can't put the hide of the animal. If you slaughter an animal on Yantif, you can't take the hide and put it on the floor so the people step on it. Why would you want people to step on it? Because that hardens it. If you don't do that, it'll get ruined. So we don't allow you to do that because that, when it hardens it, it's called the malacha of me'abed. It processes the leather. You're not allowed to do that, right? It like turns it into leather, processes the skin. So you can't do that. Velo yad bihanu, and you can't even lift it up. Let's say you put it down, you can't lift it up because it's muktzah. Muktzah things can't be moved. Unless it had meat on it still from the animal, and then it's kind of secondary to the meat, and then it could be carried. Beit Hillel matirin. Beit Hillel say there's no problem. We're going to have to see on what basis does Beit Hillel permit this. Okay, let's start with the Gemara. Tana. So there's a Beitzah quoted. Vishavim, they agree. We're back to whether you can carry the pestle or not. Vishavim, she'im kitsev alav basal she'asur l'taltal. They both agree, though, that if you did already, let's say you used it anyway to chop your meat up on it, this pestle, that you cannot carry it after that. In other words, once you used it for its purpose, you're no longer, even Beit Hillel agrees that you can't move it anymore. Because at this point, you have no use for it. Now it's back to being a pestle, which is forbidden on Shabbat or on Yantif. Amar Abai. Abai now points out, machloket be'eli. Even though you knew this already, but the machloket's about a pestle. Aval betavra garme divrei hakol mutar. But if you're using, okay, I'll use the Koran's translation, a wooden anvil, which is like a stand that they would put things on. If you're using that, everyone agrees it's permitted. To which the Gemara says, pshita, eli tnan. Why would you think it was forbidden? The Mishnahs used the word Eli. Obviously, it only meant a pestle. It wasn't talking about this anvil that you want to use as your cutting board. So now what's the issue with an anvil? So an anvil is not forbidden. It's not a klisha melachto isul. It's to put things on. It can be used as a stand. So therefore, it's of course it's permitted also, besides the fact that it says Eli in the Mishnah, but also Eli is a klisha melachto isul and a tarvar garma is not. So the Gemara says, well, ma'u detema hu adin dafilu tavra garme nami. You might have thought that this anvil is also a problem. And then why would it specifically just say Eli? Well, haid katane Eli lo diachak kochan de Beit Hillel. Dafilu davar shemelachto leisur nami sharu. They wanted to show maybe they only brought the Eli, not because it's only an Eli. Also a klish melachto leheter, there's a machloket about it. But the Eli, we're telling you that Beit Hillel is saying even an Eli is going to be permitted, even something that's usually used for something forbidden, we're still going to allow it. It's like the bigger Pidush is always the one who matirs, who permits something. So Kamash Malan, that's why Abai wants to tell us, no. Tavra Garma is actually okay according to everybody. Ika Amre, some people read this whole sugya differently. that Amar Abaye lo nitzracha ela afilu tavra garme chadite. That Abaye says it was to tell you even a tavra garma that's new would be a problem. Now, it's not just an Eli, but also a new tavra garma. Mao detema. Sorry. He's telling you my mistake. Let me read it again. Lo nitzracha ela afilu tavra garma chadite. It's not just to teach you a tavra garma. Everybody knows the tavra garma will be allowed because it's a klisha malachto lehetel. What would be even the issue? But what's he telling you? He's telling you even a brand new one. Why a brand new one that's never been used? Because really all it is a wooden anvil. It's really a piece of wood, and a piece of wood really has no purpose. And you might have thought maybe I'll change my mind and I won't want to use it as a tavra garment, in which case it's just a piece of wood, which is a useless item and it has no purpose whatsoever, and then it would be forbidden because it's useless. Kamash malan, that's why it's telling you no. Even a new tavra garment that you've never used, you'd be allowed to carry in order to chop your meat on it, even though maybe theoretically you'll change your mind and then it'll be useless, but we allow it anyway. Now we're going to question, wait a minute then. Ubeit Shammai, who don't permit this, lochai she lim luche, what? Beit Shammai, according to this, Abaye had said, even Beit Shammai agree that it's permitted. So if that's the case, they're not worried clearly according to what we just explained, that you'll change your mind about it. So the Gemara says, Beit Shammai isn't worried about you changing your mind, but we're going to show you cases where Beit Shammai is worried about you changing your mind. The Hatanya, doesn't it say in a Beitzah? Beit Shammai omrim, ein molichim tabach v'sakin etzel behema, v'lo behema etzel tabach v'sakin. So Beit Shammai says, we don't allow you to carry or to kind of move. Now we're talking about distances here, okay? Beit Shammai says, we don't allow you on Yom Tov to bring the butcher and, the shochet really, is we're talking about the slaughterer, and a knife to the animal if it's really far away. Okay, we don't make this big effort to kind of schlep things far on Yom Tov, not to bring the butcher and the knife to the animal, and not to bring the animal to the butcher and the knife. Beit Hillel say, well, we have no problem. What's the issue? Beit Shammai omrim, ein molechim tavlin umadoch etzel medocha. Okay, you can't bring the spices and this is the pestle in to have it, right, to bring it a far distance to the medocha, okay, to the mortar. V'lo medocha, not the mortar, etzel tavlinu madoch, to where the spices and the madoch are. Because, right, both of these are really issues that maybe you'll change your mind about things and you'll decide not to do this at all. Okay, you might decide, oh, you know what, I don't really want to crush it. And then it's really, right, that there's no reason why we would have allowed you to do it. And Beit Hillel says, molichim ze etzel zeh. They say we have no problem. It's really fine. Okay, so if that's the case, what do you see here? Beit Shammai is concerned that you maybe will change your mind. So why do we allow this? So then, right, so why do we allow it here? So they say, hachi hashta, what? You're comparing two totally different things. Bishlama behema atelim luche, damar nishbochai behema chusha. I want to leave this animal because it's too thin. In other words, you might go bring it to this animal, and then it turns out the animal's so thin it's not worth slaughtering. So there's no meat on it. And then you'll have to go find a different animal. So you might change your mind about this whole thing, and therefore don't schlep the animal because you might change your mind about it. Also with something that you're cooking, you also might change your mind because what might happen? Damar nishbachai kedera debai tavlin umaytina achrine delobai tavlin. You might end up bringing something else that doesn't even need spicing. And then, right, you're going to end up not needing what you thought you needed, right? You're not going to need to crush the spices in it. So now they say, therefore, what's the issue? Therefore, but hachamai ikalamemar mimlach v'lo taval kevan deshachte taval kam. Those are all things that maybe you'll change your mind about. But once you've slaughtered the meat and you need to chop the meat on something, you're obviously going to chop the meat. It's not like you're not going to chop the meat. It's something that has to happen. You can't eat the meat without cutting it up. So therefore, there's no concern here. So it's not like Beit Shammai has a general thing. Do we worry you're going to change your mind or do we not worry? It's more an issue of What's the likelihood of you changing your mind about this type of case versus a different type of case? You can't put the hide of the animal on the ground so people can trample on it because that's ibud. They're going to end up, but you're basically putting it there in order for someone to step on it to process the hide. So Tana. So right, it says Vishavin shamochin alav basar litzali. What can you do? You can put the meat on top of the hide and pour salt on it. And when you pour the salt, that will cause it to harden, basically. So you can salt it not directly, but by putting salting the meat, putting the meat on there, and then the salt will get on it. That's a good way to resolve it. Now, what's the issue here? The issue is that Beit Hillel allows this. The whole reason Beit Hillel allows this is because, and we're going to get to this soon, if we don't allow this, you're going to end up not slaughtering your animal because all of this is going to go to waste. So Beit Shammai come up with a way that we can avoid the waste without having it be more direct, like you're putting it on the floor and people stepping on it. So he says you could put it under roasted meat, that you're salting, and that would work. Amar Abaye lo shanu ela litzali, aval likdera lo. You can't put it near a pot because a pot you pour a lot of salt in, and then it really looks like you're pouring a lot of salt on this. So the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious that you can't? And it said slitnan. It's just like we said before. Why did Abaye said in Eli but not Tavragarma? Same thing here. It said it very clearly. So obviously it meant litzli and not in a pot. So hakamash manan da'afilu litzli ke'en k'derasu. What they wanted to say is if you're salting meat the way you would salt a pot full of food, where you put a ton of salt in, then you wouldn't be able to do that with the hide underneath because it will look like you're doing it specifically for that reason. Specifically to salt it, and not that you're just happens to be there while the meat is there. So sometimes tzli becomes more like a ktera depending on how much salt you're using. Tanu Rabbanan, ein mochin et hachalavim ve'em ma'apchim behem. You can't salt the chalev. These are the fats that you're not allowed to eat, but you can use them. People use them for oil, for candles, and for other things. So, but you also, the chalev would rot and spoil. Again, this is without refrigeration or anything like that, all this stuff would spoil. So what you would do is you would salt it or do some sort of process to it in order for it to get the right consistency and not rot. So basically, they say here, you can't salt them because, again, it's like ibud of the ore. It's like processing it. And you can't flip them upside down because they're totally muktzah, because you have nothing to do with them on Yantif, because they're not food and you can't eat them. It's forbidden to eat them. So now they say, Mishum Rabbi Yeshua Amru, but they say in the name of Rabbi Yeshua, Shotcham b'ruach al gabei yetedot. You can expose it to air by putting it on pegs, and that way the air will get to it, but you won't actually be directly doing any sort of process to it. So that's the best solution, he says. Amar Rav Matna halacha, and he obviously disagrees with the Tanna Kama. Amar Rav Matna halacha Rabbi Yeshua. Rav Matna says the halacha is like Rabbi Yeshua. Iga de Amri. Some people say Amar Rav Matna ein halacha Rabbi Yeshua. Some people say the Rav Matna says the halacha is not like Rabbi Yeshua. So to which the Gemara says, Bishlama, I understand why Lamanda Amar halacha Rabbi Yeshua. The one who tells us the halacha is like Rabbi Yeshua makes a lot of sense because Itzrich, he needed to tell us that why. Sal Gadat Hachamina, you might have thought. Generally, if an individual goes against Tanna Kama, we normally assume Tanna Kama is representative of the rabbi's opinion, and an individual versus the majority, we go by majority. So, Maud, and therefore, the Kamash Malan halacha ki yachid. Therefore, they're telling you, in this case, it's an exception to the rule. So, Rabbanit comes to tell you, we pass on like Rabbi Yeshua, who's an individual, even though he disagrees with the majority. Ella Lamanda Amar, but the one who says Ein halacha pshita yechiv rabim halacha kirabim. But if you say the halacha is, if Rabbi Matna said the halacha is not like Rabbi Yeshua, why would he need to say that? The assumption I would have come to, the conclusion I would have come to if I had just read that was, of course, we paskin against Rabbi Yeshua. We paskin like Tanna Kama, so he wouldn't need to tell us that because we always hold by the majority. So Ma'u detema mistaber tamei de Rabbi Yeshua. You might have thought he actually has a good reason. What's his reason? It's true that normally we hold by the majority, but not if there's a very convincing argument to hold like Rabbi Yeshua. The elo sharitle, if we don't allow you to do something with this chalev, what are you going to do? Mimna v'lo shachit. You're going to end up not slaughtering on Yantif, and that's what we're all trying to avoid. We want you to fulfill Simchat Yom Tov, have meat on Yantif, and therefore we want to make sure that everything's in place so that you'll do that. And if you're going to have all this lost stuff, like your hide, you won't be able to put on the ground, and it'll get ruined. And the fats are going to get ruined, and we don't allow you to put them on pegs in order to air out. So Kamash Malan, you might have thought we hold like him. No, the answer is, according to the reading, that we don't hold like Rabbi Yoshua, that's what Rabbanit said. It's to tell you that we don't hold that way. So the Gemara asks, but Maishnami or Lifnei Darsan, but why is it different than the hide? The hide we're allowed to put on the ground because we hold like Beit Hillel. So Hatam lo mucha milta, mishum dechaze lemizga aleh. When you put that hide on the ground, it could be you're putting it there just so you can have something to sit on. But it's not proven, it's not clear that you're doing it in order not to ruin it, right? To start the processing, right? To do the ibud, the processing of the leather. So here, it's very clear though, you would not be putting that fat on the pegs were it not because you were trying to keep it from rotting and that it's actually starting the process of processing it. So it's definitely not possible because there's no other reason you'd be doing that. And therefore, this is like the Marit Ayin. It looks like it's very clear what you're doing. Whereas if we can, right, obviously when you put the hide on the ground, you're really doing it so that people step on it and it starts the process from going before it gets ruined. But one could claim that you're putting it there to rest on, to sit on as like a mat on the floor, like a picnic picnic, what do you call it? A picnic sheet or something. So because of that, we allow that, but we don't allow this, right? Hacha ati l'meimar, my time was sharele Rabbanan. But when it comes to the chelev, the fats, people are going to say, why did the rabbis allow me to do this? They must have permitted it so that it doesn't rot, in which case they're going to say, Mali l'mishtechinu, what's the difference if I put it on pegs? Mali l'mamlechinu. What's the difference if I salt it? And then people are going to start salting it and think that it's okay to salt it, and it's really not. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Now we have a lach in the name of Shmuel. Molech adam kama chatichot basar bevat achat. You can take a bunch of pieces of meat and salt them all at once, because again, salting keeps the meat better, right, from spoiling. Even though, right, you slaughtered a piece of meat, it was a lot of meat. You don't need it all on Yantif. But since pouring salt on meat is like one act of just dumping some salt, it's not what we call a tirchi yatera. It's not a lot of extra work. It's not a big effort, and you do it all like at once, so it's fine. Even if you only really need one piece. He would do what we call ha'arama, which is kind of like tricking a little bit, and he would do one bone at a time. Okay, so it's very unclear what exactly he says. Some people think he's more strict, and some people think he's more lenient than Shmuel. Okay, so let's look at Rashi. Rashi says, Ma'alim, la'achar shemalach zo la'ochla hayom, omer chaverta areva elai la'ochla hayom, v'chozer u'mochal. What do? What's this harama? You say, oh, I want to salt this piece. So you salt that piece. Then you say, you know what? I think that piece looks better. I'm going to salt that piece. And then you say, oh, you know what? That piece looks even better. And then you salt that piece. So in that way, you can do it even one by one. So if you read like Rashi, it sounds like he's being more lenient. You can even do it one by one as long as you use this Ha'arama method of saying, oh, well, I didn't really, I changed my mind. I want to use that one. And then, oh, I changed my mind, even though you know from the beginning that you're going to keep changing your mind, but we allow it in that way. New Mishnah. And then, by the way, then you don't have to do them all at once, right? You can do one by one, which is probably a little more effective also than just throwing salt on all of them. Okay, some people, though, say that he's more strict. There's a bit of a debate about it because he thinks you can't do it all at once. And you have to do it one by one, but then, you know, you have to do it one by one, but you could do it with this harama. That's the only way to do it one by one. Okay, Mishnah. We're going to see in the Gemara, they're going to say this means from stores. The trisim are the shutters. They would have shutters. It was kind of like their door to, or windows. They would close their windows. It was a way of like sealing their walls of their store. So Beit Shammai says you can't open them up, and we're going to see in a minute, obviously not put them back in if you already took them out. Ubeit Hillel mitirim af lachzir. Beit Hillel permit even to put them back in. Okay, the first thing you have to know about this Mishnah is people would sell items. There were stores open on Yantif. It sounds crazy, but they would have, you could go into a store, go to a shop owner. I guess the way you go to a restaurant if you're, let's say, in Europe and there's not a lot of kosher places, and, sometimes they have these kosher meals or a Chabad, you eat there. It's kind of like a store, right? They allow you to eat and you pay after Yantif, basically. So, or after Shabbat. So here also, they would have stores where people could get food and items on Yantif, and they would kind of pay, right? No one would write down what they took. It would all have to be by an honor system, I guess. And they wouldn't weigh or measure anything. It would be just like, okay, I took this, I'll pay you back tomorrow, something around the amount of what I took. So Beit Shammai says, well, you can't take out your windows to open up your store on Yantif. Beit Hillel permit even putting it back in. Now, the question here, the issue here seems to be somewhat about a building issue. Some people think that Beit Hillel says it's not a problem because they don't think there's binyan b'kelim. This isn't something attached to the ground, this window. And therefore, it's not like you're really building. It's like we saw a whole sugya in Shabbat. We saw it a few times, actually, about pokikin, about putting in the stopper and to kind of close up the window. It's very similar to that. So it seems it's not really a real binyan issue. Otherwise, Beit Hillel wouldn't allow this, right? Or maybe we say en binyan b'kelim. There's a whole debate about exactly how to read this. We'll see more about it in the Gemara. My trisim. So first the Gemara starts off and says, what are these trisim? Amar ula trisei chaniyot. We're talking about the shutters of a store. Va'amar ula. Furthermore, ula says, shlosha dvarim hitiru sofan mishum tchilatan. There's three things that they permitted, the end because of the beginning. That they allowed you to do something so that you would start something earlier. Meaning, let's see. In other words, it was important to us that you start something, therefore we permitted even something later that you might be really not something we really wanted you to do on Yantif, but we're going to allow it because of some more important thing, which is Elohen or Lifnei Hadorsan, which is to allow us to put the hide on the ground. Why do we allow that? Because if we didn't allow it, you would never slaughter your animal. And if you don't slaughter your animal, you're not going to fulfill Simchat Yom Tov. So we permit something later because otherwise you wouldn't even start and slaughter your animal and then you'd have no meat to eat on Yantif. Second thing, Trisei Chaniyot, same idea. If we didn't allow you to open your windows and we didn't allow you to put them back in place, because you might think, okay, open, yes, but not to put back in place. But if we didn't allow you to put them back in place, all your produce would get stolen. People, right? That's like the way you locked your store. And then you'd never do it. So in order to permit this so that people could have food for Yantif, they permitted this putting back into its place and even taking them out. This is a totally different topic. This is that you can't do something medicinal on Shabbat. So you can't put a bandage on with some cream. But in the Beit HaMikdash, they allowed people to return a bandage that had some cream on it back onto your body because the Kohanim, when they worked, they couldn't have any separation between them, their hands, and the avodah they were doing, the work. So if they made them take off all their bandages, but if you weren't allowed to put it back on Shabbat, people wouldn't take it off, and then people wouldn't want to do the work in the temple. So because of if it would prevent them from doing work in the temple, we allowed it. The Rechava Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Rechava says in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, Afa Potech Chavito Umatchil B'isato Al Gav HaRegel, V'Aliba to Rabbi Yehuda D'Amar Yigmor. This is a totally different issue about Truma and Tahara. What this meant was that if you're a store owner and you open a barrel of wine and comes an Am Haaretz into your store and he touches it. Okay, this is like, you see all these signs in stores. If you touch, it's yours, right? Don't touch this. And if you do, well, you're buying it. So if an Am Haaretz, they didn't say that in those days, but if an Am Haaretz touched it, and Am Haaretz was suspect that he didn't keep laws of purity and impurity, so he was assumed to be impure. Therefore, if he touches it, he's going to make it all impure. So the rabbis permitted on the holiday, because a lot of people came to stores, that even if an Am Haaretz touched your stuff, it didn't make it impure. So therefore, came the rabbis and they said, but wait, if you, comes Rechava and he says in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, if you have a store and you open your barrel of wine and you start selling, but you don't sell it all on Yantif, on the holiday, not the Yantif, but the whole holiday, then after the holiday, and as the rabbis permitted it for the holiday, but after the holiday, it's now going to be impure and you're not going to be able to sell it. So Rabbi Yehuda says Yigmor. If you already opened it, you can continue selling it even after the holiday. The rabbis disagree with him and think only during the holiday. So that's another one Rechava adds to the list, which again, we allow you to do it so that people will sell items on the holiday, otherwise they won't sell. So the Gemara is going to go through the whole list and say, why does Ula say these cases? They're all mentioned in a Mishnah. And why does Rechava say it? It's also mentioned in a Mishnah. So here goes. Or lifnei dorsan tanina. We already have it in the Mishnah. That was our Mishnah. It said it, right? Beit Shammai permits. So why is he telling us this? Now remember, Ula said this is permitted as one of three things that are permitted because if we don't allow it, you'll come not to slaughter your animal. Ma'u detema. Well, you might have thought maybe it's for a different reason. Ma'u detema tamai de Beit Hillel. The reason Beit Hillel allows it is mishum de mechzeh lemizgalai. Maybe it's because it looks like you're putting it on the floor just so you could sit on, in which case, erev Yom Tov nami. Then, even if you slaughtered it at erev Yom Tov, you'd be allowed to do it. Kamash malan, that's what Yula taught us. It's only so that you slaughter it on Yom Tov, which means if you slaughter it before Yom Tov, we won't allow this. And therefore, de Yom Tov in, de erev Yom Tov lo. It's only permitted if it was an animal slaughtered on Yom Tov. It also says it in the Mishnah. It says in the Mishnah, so, and that was all because so that if we don't allow you to put it back in, then you'll never open your store on Yom Tov. So why is he telling us this? Well, ma'u detema, you might have thought, again, each time we're going to say, you might have thought the reason was this. The tamayu de Beit Hillel mishum de ein binyan b'kelim ve'ein stira b'kelim, as I mentioned before, maybe it's because he doesn't think that there's any building involved in putting a piece of wood into your wall or taking it out of your wall or a shutter or whatever it is. So, and then you would say, dafilu de batim nami, then it wouldn't just be an issue for stores, it would be an issue for anyone's shutters in their house. Kamash malan, that's why it comes to teach you. It's only for stores so that people will sell their stuff on Yom Tov. It also appears in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, it's permitted to return it back to your, put the bandage back on in the temple, but not outside the temple. So it sounds pretty clear. Well, if you had that, Ma'u Detema, you would have thought, maybe the reason is because your Rabbanits don't apply in the temple, and this is all rabbinic. Whole issue of medicine is so that you might come to crush up spices and grind up things, but it's not forbidden by Torah law. So you might have thought, well, there's no Rabbanits anyway in the temple. Now, this is a statement that is across the board. It's a debate about whether there's no Rabbanits at all or only certain things. But in any case, you might have thought maybe this is one of them. And therefore, and then it would apply even to a Kohen who's not supposed to be doing work. He's in the temple, even though he's not working, and it has nothing to do with the chatzitza for him. It's just, if he took it off, he could put it back on, because it ain't shvut b'mikdash. Kamash malan, that's why they came to tell you, no, hitiru sofa mishum tchilatan, which means only debar avodah in, delav bar avodah lo. Only someone who's working in the temple and needs to make sure there's no separation between him and the work he's doing, like accepting the blood or slaughtering or something like that. Potechet chavito, the last case now of Rabbi Yehuda, nami tanin, it also says it. Potechet chavito in a Mishnah. If you open your barrel, umatchil beisato, you start making your dough, kneading your dough, al gav haregel. Rabbi Yehuda omer, right? If you did it, it was permitted in the regel, even if people touch it. Rabbi Yehuda omer yigmor. Rabbi Yehuda says after the holiday you could still sell it. Chachamim omrim lo yigmor. You can't sell it anymore. It's impure. Maud. So there you have it. So maud detema tumarama aretz beregel betahara shavyu Rabbanan. You might have thought that anything they touch on the regel, it's as if the amei haaretz are considered pure on the holiday. In which case, if they touch on the holiday, you'll still be allowed to sell after the holiday. And even if you didn't even start, in other words, anything they touch will be pure, even if you didn't start selling. Kamashmalan, hitiru sofa mishum tchilatan, which means hitchil in lo hitchil lo. We're only going to permit it if you actually started selling, but if you didn't start selling yet, then we're not going to permit this. It's only if you started selling it and then he touched it. If he touched it from the beginning, we're actually not going to view it as if, he's pure. No, it's only a heter once you started selling something. Ve'ula, my time alo amrahan. So now the question is, why didn't Ula give this last one? He wasn't talking about things that were issues that were debatable. This was a debatable issue because the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. So Hane Nami Plugtaninu. But what do you mean? All these other cases were machlokets Beit Shammai Beit Hillel. So if he didn't want to mention things that there were arguments about, then why did he mention all the things that are in our Mishnah that Beit Shammai says yes and Beit Hillel says no? So obvious answer: Beit Shammai and Kol Beit Hillel in a Mishnah. We can ignore Beit Shammai. Basically, everybody knows we don't hold like Beit Shammai, so we can put that on the side, and it's as if there's no machloket about it. It's interesting in and of itself. Okay, now we're going to say, just like we did 2 dapim ago, when we had a Mishnah and we said, well, we thought that was the machloket. Our Mishnah says the machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel is this, but Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar had a different version of their machloket. We're going to have the same thing here. Matnitin deloki haitana. Our Mishnah obviously doesn't match Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar because Titania, it says in a Beitzah, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Okay, before we even go on, let's just remember our Mishnah. Beit Shammai says you can't take off the windows, nor can you return them. Beit Hillel says you can take them off and you can even return them, right? The shutters. So he says, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Modim Beit Shammai uBeit Hillel shemesalkin et hatrisim b'yom tov. They both agree that you can take the windows off. You can open them in order to sell. Even Beit Shammai agrees with that. See, it's a different version of the machloket. Lo nechlaku ela lachzir. Their machloket is about returning it. Shebeit Shammai omrim ein machzirin uBeit Hillel omrim af machzirin. Beit Shammai said you can't return them to their place, and Beit Hillel says you can. It's only after you sold, but everyone agrees that to sell you can open it up. The Beitzah continues. In which case is this? If they have a hinge. But if it doesn't have a hinge, and then it really doesn't look like you're building, you're just sticking it back in, you're not even doing anything serious with it. Everyone agrees it's permitted, even to return. But wait, isn't there a Beitzah that says no, the machloket is when they don't have a hinge. But if it has a hinge, everyone agrees it's forbidden. So now it says different, right? First, they said the machloket is when there is a hinge. When there's no hinge, it's permitted. And this one says when there's no hinge, there's a machloket. When there is a hinge, all agree it's forbidden. It's the same direction, but it's different for each one. So Amar Abai is going to say there's 3 options. And there's a nice picture in the Koran. I'll hold it up for the screen to show you the way the Koran shows you the picture. They're going to say there's 3 types. Okay, here's the first one where there's no hinge at all. Okay, so Amar Abai, b'sheyesh lahem tzir min hatzad. Okay, let's do this one. Divrei hakol asur. That means if it has a hinge at the top and a hinge at the bottom, it's got 2 hinges, then everyone agrees that's really forbidden because it's much closer to building than anything else. Ein lahem tzir kol ikar, the top one, if it has no hinge at all and you're just putting it in its place, then divrei hakol mutal. Everyone agrees it's permitted. Ki pligi b'sheyesh lahem tzir ba'emsa. The issue is if there's like one hinge on the side and it kind of hooks in, that is already, I don't know if, by the way, this picture is definitely the picture of the way hinges look then, but it's a possibility, and it's something in between where it doesn't really look like building, but a little bit looks like building. And that is the case they're actually going to have a debate about. And that's, again, this always a different version, that the debate is only about putting back in and not about taking it out in the first place. And then in addition, we have this other issue about with the hinge, without the hinge, and what exactly are they debating? That really didn't relate to what we were saying before, but it does define their machloket in a bit of a different manner. With that, we will finish. Have a Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov to everyone.